Normally, Marley's the one who does the research on these people because, she has, it's one of her skills is she can, prepare these shows in a way that I can't. But sometimes we'll be talking about people that I'm already a fan of, and so I end up dominating the discussion. But
the Howard Hughes episode comes to mind.
Oh, yeah. I can't explain my tastes in heroes, but all of them are flawed in some way.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. We're starting what will end up being a three-part series in which we focus on a phenomenon that is surprisingly common in the field of estate planning as it pertains to conflicts between beneficiaries, claimants, would-be beneficiaries. And that's something that really didn't come to my attention as fully as it should have until I read an article that appeared in Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. Justin, let's cite this article, and the article talked about this phenomenon of stepmoms and stepkids and the inclination for conflict between these two parties or groups of parties. And of course, I knew that, and we all know somewhat, you probably have some experience if you've had death of various family members in which there's been an estate opened and there was ever any conflict. Most vulnerable, we've even talked about on this show, is the fact that you have blended families. And blended families are vulnerable because there aren't these relationships that have historically existed, of course, between these nuclear families and families in which all the kids, all the grandkids, the ancestors are the ancestors of everybody. They may show favoritism, but it's the favoritism that is often tolerable within a family. What's not tolerable is when you have an outsider who comes in, assumes a position that the children at least, and probably everyone in the family tree below, thinks does not do a very good job of occupying that role compared to the person who originally was there. So in our example, we're talking about a case where there's a stepmom, and stepmom survives dad. This is statistically a very probable scenario, another thing we've talked about. So when you put these factors together, you can see how you have this brew that is incredibly vulnerable to conflict and argument and litigation. And there's no real simple solution to it, but it's something that I think by talking about it and giving examples of how it's played out in different families. Some will be negative examples, meaning that's not something I want to do. Others will be positive examples where you look at how people in particular handled it and you say, that I want to make a note of. Now, some of you, of course, will not have a second wife or a second husband, or you won't be in this position where you're looking at blended families. But we know statistically in America, this is the norm. It's not the day when it was when I was a child, when some of you were children, when it's a relatively uncommon thing. The Brady Bunch kind of brought to the screen in the 70s the fact that the complexion of the American family was, even at that stage, very much changing. And it has continued to change. So statistically, you have a substantial percent. No one knows the exact percentages because you can't accumulate this data from 50 different states and 100 different courtrooms or jurisdictions within every state. So all people can do is sort of speculate about how common this is. But just ask yourself, and I've certainly talked to our estate planning lawyers about this too, and that's that how often do we see this? And we see it all too commonly. But it's not simply enough to say, oh, well, it applies whether it's a stepdad or a stepmom. No, this phenomenon that occurs in far greater numbers than anything else is stepmom and stepkids. And again, it's largely just the longevity factor. You go into a nursing home and count the number of men in that nursing home versus the number of women. I mean, it's stunning how different it is. And so I think we need to take this bull by the horns and talk about this phenomenon. It is so ubiquitous around us, particularly in probate courts. And let's talk about ways these problems can be prevented in some cases. In other cases, they can be managed around, they can be mitigated. But we aspire to be able to teach you ways in which perhaps you can avoid it entirely. And one thing about it, it does make for interesting discussion. Marley, I think you'll agree, when you look at these cases, boy, some of the knockdown dragouts that you have in these families between us, that surviving stepmom, the wicked stepmother, that phrase didn't make its way into the English language without reason. You know, you don't hear of the wicked stepdad. So we can find an abundance of cases to also bring to your attention to illustrate ways in which this occurs, the problems, the solutions, and we think we can make it very interesting. Marley, do you have any comments on this before we talk about our first person?
Not a ton, but like you said, I think it's just going to be very interesting seeing all of this and just the way it's played out with famous people. And then, a lot of people might be able to correlate it to their own families. So there might be a lot of lessons learned here.
Yeah, that's a good point, is that, the examples we will be using will, of course, as they always have been on this show, is we try to go with celebrities, names that are familiar to you. It makes it more interesting, but it also often elevates the stakes in the dispute. For example, you have in most of these cases a lot more money than perhaps the average person would, but the principles are the same. So it really provides an opportunity to have rich examples where you can learn a lot. And some of the same solutions will apply to you. Some won't, because some solutions will involve a lot more expensive or sophisticated solutions depending on the size of the estate. But the fundamentals, I would argue, the substantial majority will be applicable to anybody, rich or poor. Well, poor, I don't know. Poor, often you don't have litigation because there is no estate to argue over. So really we're talking middle class and above. But that includes a lot of people, and I suspect the substantial majority of you.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
So with that, I will go ahead and disclose who we're going to talk about this week before Marley gives us an overview of the person's life. Many of you who've watched this show very long know that I'm a big fan of Frank Sinatra. I've always liked Frank Sinatra, and I've come to like him more as I've gotten older, interestingly enough. And perhaps many of you share that same feeling. I think he had a very special voice. He had just a way of singing that was just very unique. His ability to phrase music, the feeling that he invested in music, no one had really done before. He was a first, and he was a first in a lot of other ways in musical history of the 20th century in America. He really was the first superstar, something where we saw what we'd later see with Elvis Presley and we saw with the Beatles. Well, the first time you had screaming teenagers lining around a building, which I think was Paramount in New York City, that was just something that really the world hadn't seen in the United States, at least in music, in popular music. So Frank Sinatra he was a phenomenon, and he continued to be up until his death. So that's also unique. I mean, we have very popular musicians who come and go, but for them to retain a great deal of respect throughout the industry, as he did up until his death. I mean, the Duets album, which he did in the 90s, was something that, everyone wanted to be on that. And I mean, I'm talking about the young popular singers. They all wanted to be on that. And since then, others have done duet albums. and I think in largely an imitation or because of the example of Frank Sinatra. So now it's common for a lot of these legends to team up with younger people and to do these duet albums. But when Frank Sinatra did it, I don't know of anyone having done it before. So so much I can say about Frank Sinatra, and I probably don't have to say a lot, nor does Marley, because many of you will already know a lot about his life, depending on your ages. But we know some won't, so we're going to talk about his life, and hopefully those of you who already are fans will still learn some things. And for those who want to inform us of some things, maybe call our attention to something we didn't get right. Now, I can't imagine that could happen, could it, Marley?
No.
Now, in the event that you can correct us on something, we want to know, so give us your comments and your thoughts. And incidentally, hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. You hear that a lot from these shows, from podcasts, but it really is the only way we have of knowing, are we hitting the mark? Are we being useful? Do you like what we're doing? Should we change up something we're doing? So be sure and hit the like and subscribe button. So Marley, I'm going to hand it to you. So let's talk about Frank Sinatra.
Yeah, so Frank Sinatra was born December 1915 in Hoboken, New Jersey. His parents were Italian immigrants, and their names were Natalina, but she went by Dolly, and Antonio, but he went by Marty. So they came over, and they probably just tried to Americanize themselves the best that they could, and they just really wanted the best for their family and their son. Frank's birth was pretty difficult. He was a 13.5-pound baby. And he had to be delivered with forceps, which if you've ever seen pictures of him, or, I'm sure a lot of our viewers already know who he is, have seen him, so on and so forth, but that's where he got all of his scars from, on like his face and his neck, and it also left him with a perforated eardrum for his entire life. So the fact that he kind of went on to become a singer with all of that, it's not necessarily debilitating, but that definitely would have caused some challenges for him.
Yeah, it was a breech birth, apparently.
Yes, yeah.
And they thought that he was actually, the child had been delivered dead, but
Yes.
They put the child under cold water as they did back then, and like a minute or so went by, or some substantial period of time, and that was when he cried, and of course they knew it was a live birth, but it was very difficult, and as a result, Dolly didn't have any more kids, did she?
Oh, she didn't. I don't know if that was just her own choice or if because, she wasn't able to after him, but she didn't at all. He was a single child his whole life. But yeah, his grandma was the one who stuck him under the cold water and, thankfully, like he woke up, started crying, and they had a healthy baby, which, 13.5 pounds is a really big baby too. So I could only imagine all of the trauma that everybody went through with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so Frank was raised Roman Catholic. This kind of plays through his whole entire life. He goes from kind of religious to not religious to religious again, but I don't ever think he necessarily left his faith. His mom was a nurse and she did all kinds of things. She was really big into their government. She, ran an abortion clinic for the Italian Catholics.
Well, do we know that? Do we know that?
Oh, so it was reported in one of his friend's books, in like an autobiography, an autobiography. And it was reported, and the kid the guy who wrote it knew him from childhood. So I'm gonna say yes, it's true, just because I think that she got some backlash over it throughout their community, but a lot of his family had ties with the mobs and everything, with the mob and everything like that. So I don't think a lot could happen to them no matter what she was really doing.
Yeah, it's not shocking, except, I do think that she, took somewhat seriously her Catholic faith. And I know that that story has been reported a lot. So I challenged it, not to say that I know it's wrong, but it may be right. And it wouldn't be completely out of character, except for the fact that they were very Catholic. But she did run a tavern or a speakeasy. It was illegal.
Yes. Yeah, they did run a tavern together. She also was very outspoken in the Democratic government within their community.
Yeah, she was a ward boss, I believe, wasn't she?
Yeah. So she made some really big moves, and everybody says that they think she had the biggest push on Frank in his singing career. She was actually the one, as we'll kind of talk about, who got him into his first band. And she just encouraged him the whole entire time. And his dad, Marty, was actually a boxer. His dad was illiterate and he dropped out of school really, really early. So he always, encouraged Frank and said that an education is going to get you where you want to go in life. And he wanted him to become some type of engineer. So he really pushed for him in school. But as we'll kind of see, Frank actually does drop out of high school. He goes to junior high, or sorry, he didn't drop out. He was actually expelled because of rowdiness after 47 days. I couldn't find what kind of rowdiness, but I can only kind of imagine.
We could summon up some candidates, right?
Yes, yeah. But throughout his whole entire childhood, he was bullied a lot. And this kind of comes into play in adulthood too. He's always been a really like short, skinny guy, and he's had all of his facial features with the scars and everything. So he was bullied, but he did really just like make his way through, and he did everything that he wanted to during his childhood, and he was just bound and determined to always make a name for himself. He just knew he was going to be big. He said it to friends all the time. He was like, I'm destined for greatness pretty much. And nobody really believed him, and I mean, he proved them all wrong, which I thought was pretty funny.
Yeah, he started singing I guess in that short period in high school, and and then he found that he could, in his mother's tavern, essentially, that he could, get nickels and dimes for singing, and sometimes he would just sing without being paid. But he really liked having an audience, and so he decided very early that he thought that he was capable of being a professional singer. And he was heavily influenced by Bing Crosby, wasn't he?
Yes. Bing Crosby, Gene Austen, and Russ Columbo were some of like his really idolized singers.
Yeah, and he was in a quartet briefly when he was 17. It gave him the opportunity, though, to travel, and they actually went as far as California. They didn't make any money to speak of, but it was a chance for him to get exposed to the circuit and to learn something about the music business.
Yeah. And I think that was just really important for him. So then his mom gets him the spot in a group called the Three Flashes. She like asked one of the, I believe it was the drummer in the band. She knew him somehow, and she was like, hey, do me this favor. He owed her a favor or something. And so they finally let him in, and they renamed the band to Hoboken 4, but they didn't really want Frank being in on like a lot of things until they realized just how well he could sing. And he was also doing a lot of vocal coaching at that time as well, which helped him sing like 2 octaves higher. And it just really like set him apart from a lot of other singers.
So after this Hoboken 4 kind of fell apart, that was when he went with Harry James. And Harry James, I think he was with him 1 or 2 years, and then Tommy Dorsey came along, and that was a big gig. The best orchestra, arguably the best orchestra in the country. They were very popular. He got, he was going to be around the best musicians in virtually all the instruments. I mean, Tommy Dorsey had a reputation for being a perfectionist, and he was very difficult to work for, but he had marvelous talent. And so for Sinatra to spend, I don't know, the 3 or 4 years that he was with him, I mean, was a real masterclass in learning the business, learning even to the extent he read music. He never fully read music, but he definitely learned a lot about reading music. I think it's unfair to say he didn't read music. He learned how to make sense of a sheet of music, and many of the things of his craft, I would argue, he probably learned more in the time with Tommy Dorsey. But anyway, Harry James let him out of his contract, which he didn't have to do, but Harry James was a nice guy. They remained friends the balance of their life. And then Tommy Dorsey, who wasn't such a nice guy, had this long-term contract with Sinatra. And so that led to what was recounted in a scene from Godfather, where Michael is talking to his fiancée, Diane Keaton, and he's telling her the story of how his dad had helped this young singer out, and how his dad had persuaded him, made an offer he couldn't refuse to let him out of his long-term contract. and the contract was hugely profitable for this band leader, to which she said to Michael, and Keaton said, well, why would the band leader have let him out of the contract? And so Michael said, well, he gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. And she said, I can't imagine. He said, well, he put a gun to his head. He said, you can either sign this piece of paper, either your signature is going to be on this piece of paper or your brains. And so that story, which Coppola picked up somewhere, I'm sure that maybe he's just passing it along, maybe he has more authority, but he included it in his movie, and it was a story that had been around for a long time, and no one knows for sure whether it was true, but we do know this. We do know Tommy Dorsey let Frank Sinatra out of a contract that would have been very beneficial to Tommy Dorsey over time. And that contract was long term. So
it was very
and at that point, it was clear that Frank Sinatra was going to be a big, big star. Now, I should add that the contract didn't call for him to give him away free, and meaning that it was, and this is kind of what you'd expect from The Godfather, it wasn't saying just give up your rights. It was he was offered money, and I think, I may be wrong about this, but it seems like the sum comes to mind of like $100,000.
I think that's correct.
Yeah, he was paid a significant amount of money, but clearly the money was not what he would have made, and what he knew he had every reason at the time to know that he would not make if he wouldn't make that much if he held on to Frank Sinatra. But anyway, so Sinatra breaks free, and he very quickly starts having hits, and this is in the 40s. So he breaks free. Audience, forgive us. I think it was, let's say 43 or something. And he breaks free, and then at that point, his timing's perfect. All the GIs are gone off to war, and have been for a few years. Let's talk about the war thing before we talk about his career, because I know that a lot of people are really troubled by the fact that he didn't serve in the military. What do you know about that?
So Frank was actually 4F, so he wasn't actually able to serve in the military during World War II, and that was due to the perforated eardrum, like we kind of talked about. It did kind of affect him through his whole entire life.
That's what troubled a lot of people. Is it's one thing to be 4F, which a lot of people are troubled by anyway, but he didn't appear to be troubled by it. And as you suggest, I think that a lot of guys resented him. And these guys, though, were in Europe or in Japan or in the Pacific at the time, so they're gone. So their opinion of him didn't matter so much. But their girlfriends and wives were back in the United States, and he was wooing and winning their love and affection. So he was becoming huge. Meanwhile, the husbands and boyfriends, I wouldn't say they had a strong dislike of him, but there were elements of the public that were very critical of him, feeling that if he had really tried hard, he could have gotten in the military. And they also felt he wasn't doing enough USO shows. Mm-hmm. And there were people like Jimmy Stewart, who he was older and he still pursued being in the military. So but there were a lot of famous actors at the time who did sign up and were very demonstrable about their commitment, their patriotism. So Sinatra, yes, if asked, he made clear his love and affection for this country. Always claimed to be, a very loyal patriot, but still, he really wasn't very convincing, I think, to people at the time, a lot of people, that he was that upset about his inability to put himself in the line of fire. So
yeah, a lot of people actually thought that he paid people off to avoid military service.
Yeah, and I don't believe that, but I can see that's the sort of rumors that
Yes.
would have been triggered by this.
I think it helped that the war was going on. And like you said, people thought he just didn't give enough thought to it about what's actually happening overseas because he's becoming so big. But it's also he wasn't able to serve. And so he was classified that 4F and he just kind of moved on with his life. I don't think he felt really one way or another about it. I think probably he was a little bit happy that he didn't have to go so he could continue building his career. But I also don't think that it was as big as everybody made it out to be.
Yeah, he was fiercely ambitious, and that's a trait that he had his entire life. He He was very much a very work-oriented guy. He had this incredible work ethic, and he just was somebody who worked very hard then and for the balance of his life at a time when he no longer had to even. He traveled a lot. He did a lot of tours. He did movies. He did things that he didn't need to do at times that he was financially independent and would be for the rest of his life. But he had just this very strong work ethic. And I think that as you suggest, he was preoccupied with a world that in fairness, I mean, he's probably 20 years old at this time, maybe 21, 22, and he has this world that's unfolded before him and this popularity that not only has he not seen before, no one has seen before. It's just I think that he was preoccupied with that, and yes, his mind was probably not on the war as we would like to think it was or it should have been. But again, Frank Sinatra was determined to build a career and to be as successful as he could in a way that not many artists are. I wouldn't argue that. I think many artists are not quite that ambitious, but he certainly was. So Frank Sinatra, he probably achieves the peak of his fan adulation, the teeny boppers. That was in the 40s. It peaked, and then it went away kind of quickly, meaning that, this sort of crazed Bobby sock sort of phenomenon that we saw first in the 40s, not the 50s with Elvis, but we did see it with Elvis. But with Frank Sinatra, people came home from the war. Times changed very quickly in the next couple years. America, redirected its attention, and various things going on culturally and economically. I don't know all the reasons for that. Maybe no one does fully, but his popularity was dimmed significantly. And by 1950, he was not on the top of the charts anymore.
And I think that was kind of crazy, but I mean, he held on, he tried to hold on to every little grasp of popularity that he had. I mean, he reinvented himself. We can start talking about this now, but he kind of just reinvented himself to a film actor instead. And he went on to win Oscars, Grammys. He won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for From Here to Eternity. And that was in 1953. And so I think he was just bound and determined to hold on to his success in whatever way possible.
Yeah.
And he just went on to make movies and shows, and people found their love for him again. And I think he found a new fan base as well that wasn't, people who listened to his music, and maybe they worked their way back to that even, but they loved him in film to begin with.
Yeah. I think it's accurate to say that movie may have been the single ingredient that was essential to his success thereafter. Now, there were additional things, but I think without that, I think he wouldn't have had the success he had later. And it's not obvious why that's true, but what real quickly, an overview of what went on in just a few years before that was, he had this affair with Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was, very sexy, very popular at the time, but she didn't have an image as a homemaker. And so she had a reputation of being a little bit of wild, and some of her parts and roles, substantiated that. But he and she start having an affair. He ends up getting divorced in 1951 from his first wife, this very Catholic marriage to Nancy. And this was not good for Sinatra's career. So it's just another problem for his career on top of the things we've mentioned, the changes that took place in taste. So here he is in 1951. He's divorced, getting bad press. Ava Gardner is accused of being a family breaker. What do you call that phrase?
Homewrecker.
Homewrecker, yeah. So a common phrase at the time, homewrecker. So she was villainized too, and they end up getting married, which was the plan. They get married very shortly after the divorce. So Frank is kind of at that point on the skids, and she's doing very well. She has a number of movies going, maybe Night of the Iguana. Incidentally, Night of the Iguana, you've got to see that movie. It's a Tennessee Williams movie, but she's in it. Richard Burton, great movie. Anyway, so Frank Sinatra hears about this movie called From Here to Eternity that's going to have a number of stars, Montgomery Clift and others. And so he's read for this one character, he had read about it, and he'd even read the book, and he knew this is going to be a great movie, and I'm cut out for this particular role. And he goes to his wife, and his wife uses all of her influence, and she has substantial influence at the time. And she manages to get him an audition for this role in this movie. It's a supporting role. And he ends up getting the role. Sure enough, he was absolutely confident that he would do a marvelous job. Turns out that not only is he a serviceable actor, he's an excellent actor. Another reason I like Frank Sinatra is he's so talented. He was just a superb actor. We could know his name strictly as a great actor had he dedicated his life to acting, to doing serious dramatic roles. The roles he had in these movies, Man with the Golden Arm, I mean, they're just, it's at the best. I mean, he's a superbly talented actor, and he's somebody that he only does one take. He was insistent on one take. He goes in and does one take, and that's it. He walks out of the studio. So he wasn't pleasant. But let me tell you, when he did that one take, it was marvelous, almost without exception. So this revives him. Suddenly his name's out there. People are saying good things about him. It results in his getting a new contract. He's with Capitol Records during the 50s. So we're going to move along a little more quickly here to get to what we really want to focus on. So the 50s were very good to him. He found a new audience. In some cases, it was the older audience he had before in the 40s that now are 10 years older. But he suddenly started to become that vintage, respected voice, the chairman that he became known as, or simply the voice. And I think that the 50s were very good to him. He made sure that he had the very best band leaders, the very best arrangers, the very best musicians. I mean, he was always a perfectionist in that way. He learned some of his skills from Tommy Dorsey, but also from others. And so he put out some great albums with Capitol. And then in 1960, he forms another label called Reprise Records. I'm kind of dominating this a little bit, Marley, because normally Marley's the one who does the research on these people because, she has, it's one of her skills is she can, prepare these shows in a way that I can't. But sometimes we'll be talking about people that I'm already a fan of. And so I end up dominating the discussion. But
the Howard Hughes episode comes to mind.
Oh, yeah. I can't explain my tastes in heroes, but all of them are flawed in some way. But Sinatra, I really liked his music and his career going into the 60s was different from the 50s, but it grew. It was better in the 60s than the 50s. Though some people thought there's no way this guy's going to hang on that long, and people were forecasting his decline as early as the late 40s when he was in decline. But then he had a resurrection for a period, and the people thought, well, that'll be it. But he ends up doing lots of movies in the late 50s. Some of them were not great acting movies, but they weren't intended to be. He just took those deals because there's money. Ocean's 11, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, they were okay. They're entertaining, but they're not great movies. But he did some great dramas. And the Academy Award, as you pointed out, he won. He was nominated twice. He won one supporting actor. Did he win Best Actor or Best Supporting?
He won Best Supporting Actor.
But he never won Best Actor.
Best Actor, no.
Okay. So anyway, we get to the 60s. He creates his own record label, which is unusual. We all know that Frank is demanding and unpleasant sometimes, vulgar sometimes. So he has these flaws, but ultimately he seems to end up doing the right thing artistically. And as to his wanting to have control over his career, he had some bad experiences with Capitol. He felt they didn't promote his records as they should. So he created his own label, which at the time, that was, I won't say it was unheard of. I'm sure somebody else had done it. But for the most part, that was the point people point to sort of be the moment when people in the industry saw that it was possible to go out and do something on your own. So I would say that Frank Sinatra was the most visible person to ever do this at that time. Now it's not that uncommon. The Beatles did Apple. They created the Apple label years later, and I'm sure they were influenced by the decision of Frank Sinatra. So Reprise Records, which dominated the 60s, was great. And other famous performers signed on to it. I think Nat King Cole signed on to it.
Yes.
So it was it was a savvy business move, but it was also something consistent with Sinatra's desire for artists to control their product, to control its packaging, the recording, its release. So Reprise promised that to artists. If you came onto Reprise, it was an artist-centered label. So just another innovation by Sinatra. So he goes into the 60s. We know he got involved. I'm going to move along here, Justin. Justin tells us that we need to keep this show going because sometimes
Somebody's got to.
Somebody's got to, yeah. Or we'll end up with something longer with Gone with the Wind here. But so I want to mention at least the fact that he got involved in politics. He was a big supporter of John F. Kennedy. And incidentally, he was always somebody who was very much supportive of the downtrodden. Perhaps we talked about Dolly and his, the fact that she was a fervent Democrat, a believer in helping the down and out. She perceived the Democratic Party as being that. And so Frank Sinatra, continued to have that view, although he ended up supporting Nixon later on. But still, while he became Republican later in life and supported Reagan, still in the 60s, he was still largely a very traditional Democrat. Not a Democrat we'd recognize today. I'm sure today he'd still be a Republican, but at that time, he was a big supporter of John F. Kennedy. The inauguration celebration was produced and directed by Frank Sinatra. I mean, the whole production, very complicated, major undertaking with all these stars, a huge deal. You could read there was a good section of his biography that consists of describing how he stage managed all this. So he ends up getting married again, but we haven't talked about the Ava Gardner marriage. That concluded how quickly? Pretty quickly, wasn't it?
That concluded in 1957, so pretty quickly. They actually filed for divorce, I believe, in 1955, and then it was finalized in 1957. But then he was married to Mia Farrow not quickly after that, but in 1966, so about 10 years after that. But their marriage was very brief, and they ended it in 1968.
What was he thinking?
Yeah, I know. She was 20 at the time of the marriage, and as we kind of talked about, she was just getting into her career.
And he was 50, right?
Yeah, and he was 50, and it just wasn't a good fit at all. But it's important to note that he did keep, he was on very good terms with all of his ex-wives. He kept friendships with all of them. There was never really any bad blood between any of them. And he did that throughout his whole entire life. And then he finally married his fourth wife, Barbara Marx, and that was in 1976. And he was married to her up until he died in 1998. And between her and his children from his first marriage, there wasn't a great relationship. And I don't know if that's just because he never really facilitated it, or if because his children thought he would remarry his first wife, Nancy, who was their mom, or really what happened there. And nobody can, give a definitive answer on exactly what it was and why they didn't like each other. But that does come into play later.
So, yeah, let's go over his three children, each of them.
So we've got Nancy, who is his first and eldest daughter, or his first child and eldest daughter, and then Frank Sinatra Jr., who was Sinatra's only son, and he was the middle child, and then Christina, but she goes by Tina Sinatra, and she was the youngest child.
So we're going to break this episode into two parts. We've talked about Frank Sinatra's early career, mid-career. In our next show, we'll talk about the latter part of his career and his estate planning. So until next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.